Good afternoon, I'm Max Brantley with the Arkansas Times with news in Arkansas today. Actually, the big news was last night after we taped. Toward the end of the day, the Supreme Court issued on Wednesday, an unusual day because they had judicial conference today in Fort Smith, a ruling that struck down the state's voter ID law, the 2013 law passed over Governor Mike Beebe's veto by the Republican legislature. It's a pattern bill filed in a number of other states where Republicans control the legislature. It's intended to suppress voting, no ifs, ands, or buts about it, and it succeeds in holding down turnout among Democratic constituencies, so it's an important decision. 4 members of the Supreme Court said simply that the bill was unconstitutional on its face. That is, the Arkansas Constitution says clearly what the requirements are to vote in Arkansas and says that you cannot add additional burdens to those requirements. The legislature did exactly that by requiring an ID requirement that simply required time, effort, and money for people to get the necessary ID to vote. It cost 1,000 people their ballots by absentee voting in the primary election. This is good news for Democrats, but whether it'll make a big difference in the election remains to be seen. But if some of the races are close, a few votes could make a very big difference. The law decision, though it was clear, and all those 3 Supreme Court members said it was enough that the law was not passed with the required 2/3 vote to change the Constitution. It was still clear enough that the law is dead. It's unconstitutional. You can't enforce an unconstitutional law. But Mark Martin, the Secretary of State, the state's chief election officer, nonetheless issued a confounding statement last night that said he would defend the law to the fullest extent possible. There's no way to defend a law that doesn't exist anymore. There was no way to go into federal court because this was a case that was decided strictly on state grounds. There was no federal constitutional issue raised. Then Mark Martin's office followed that up today with a memo I obtained in which it told county election commissioners that the old law would apply, they would obey the Supreme Court ruling, except that they said all first-time voters would have to produce a photo ID. This is simply wrong. The law says very clearly that the only first-time voters have to produce an ID is those who didn't provide an ID in the registration process. This is some, but by no means all first-time voters. This forced Attorney General Dustin McDaniel to have to issue a clarifying statement to once again make Mark Martin right on the law. I need not remind you that Mark Martin was absent yesterday from the AETN debate. He faces a supremely qualified Democratic opponent in Susan Inman. It was one more example of why he's not fit to be Secretary of State, and Susan Inman is, but party identification may be enough in Arkansas. On other topics, that was a mouthful. I wrote this morning about a really unusual news release, I thought. Mayor Mark Stoll of the city of Little Rock sent out a news release begging people in Little Rock to buy tickets to this Saturday's Razorback game against Georgia at War Memorial Stadium. He says, we need to sell out the stadium. That's the only way to keep the Hogs to keep playing a game in Little Rock every year, and it's a huge economic boost. Here's the deal. The UA wants $100 a ticket to see a so-so team play at War Memorial Stadium in a game that you can watch on television. I'm not particularly surprised people are reluctant to do this given the additional costs that are also necessary to attend a game there, and the fact that you're being strong-armed into making a payment into the University of Arkansas's Razorback Foundation, which doesn't share its details with the public. But moreover, there's been some interesting things written that Little Rock is an exception. Most big state schools now play all their games on their home campus, their home games anyway. They don't take a game to another city to get a crowd. Don't need to. They have bigger stadiums in Fayetteville than they have in Little Rock. And so I think inevitably Little Rock is going to lose these games. It's time for Little Rock to get used to it and to think of other ways to fill that stadium with people. There are things that can be done. For reading pleasure, I urge you to take a look at our Arkansas blog this morning and take a look at a link I've provided to the friend of court brief filed by the parents and friends of lesbian and gays in the appeal of the lawsuit seeking to strike down the state's ban on same-sex marriage. It includes the stories of a number of Arkansas families, people with children who are in same-sex partnerships, the wonderful families they've built. I found it incredibly touching and also a reminder of the difficulties that have faced gay people in Arkansas in enjoying the access to liberty and freedoms that other people enjoy. It's a read that if it doesn't have a legal impact on this case, it ought to have a personal impact on people who are interested. There was a train collision in northwest Arkansas today, something you don't hear of very often. There aren't many passenger trains in Arkansas. An excursion train in northwest Arkansas was hit by a freight train run by the same railroad. A number of people have been injured. Apparently the train stalled on a track and a freight train sent to help plowed into the other train. Finally, there's Ebola news in Arkansas today. I think politicians are whipping up unnecessary hysteria about Ebola. It's a dangerous virus. Clearly, we need to have established protocols for dealing with it, but a whole lot more people die every day of the flu and pneumonia than are dying of Ebola in the United States. Nonetheless, politicians see an opening there to play on hysteria. It's a familiar thing for politicians to do. Tom Cotton today has joined a number of Republican senators who thinks there should be a travel ban from West African countries in which the disease has been found. I think this is a bridge too far, but there's a sign that the American public is sympathetic to this point of view, and so you can always count on a Republican senator like Tom Cotton to play into those fears. Perhaps now we can bring back around the fact that Tom Cotton voted against funding that is designed specifically to respond to pandemic threats like Ebola. Finally, there was a brief flare-up of concern about a man who sought treatment for an illness at the hospital in Clinton, some symptoms similar to those suffered by Ebola patients. He apparently had been in Africa recently. The sheriff tells us as we record this that he's been cleared of Ebola concerns. We don't have the final confirmation from the hospital, but I'm hopeful that at the end of the day we will be where we are now and believing that this was just a false alarm. On that, I'll call it quits for today. I'm Max Brantley. I'll be back tomorrow.